Discuss this and all the latest developments is Zeidon Alkinani, once again, founding director of the Arab Perspectives Institute. Thank you, Zeidon, for being back with us on Al Jazeera. So the Iranians deny that talks are happening with the Americans, despite Donald Trump insisting on this going on. Is diplomacy real right now, or is this just an extension of battlefield strategy?
Well, it seems like it's also an indirect way of claiming that they're not acknowledging it or recognizing it as of yet. The way that the 15 points were shared was also in an unofficial way as of now. We're still just hearing political rumors around the corner. So each official agency needs to ensure that they are not giving up or accepting anything as long as it's not official. Also, the way that some of the rumors were spread out, according to many media observations, is that it came through an Israeli source, which means that there is an Israeli interest in ensuring that a US-Iran agreement does not undermine and does not bypass the core Israeli interests in the picture.
Yeah. On the 15-point plan, as you said, this is just reports right now, which were circulated in US media, of Trump coming up with another plan which has several points to end the conflict, which would include Iran eliminating its nuclear program completely and reopening the Strait of Hormuz in exchange for the lifting of all sanctions. Do you see the Iranians at any point agreeing to this?
It depends if the Americans would be also interested in hearing what conditions or what assurances and guarantees would be provided to the Iranians to ensure that a similar conflict does not erupt again. And we're noticing the transition in Trump's rhetoric. We're also perhaps noticing that Trump is trying to exit the war in a symbolic way, where he could go back to the American media, go back to the international community and claim that he left the war as per his conditions, whether it's those 15 points or other points that will be coming in the future.
Yeah. What does winning look like right now for either side in this conflict?
Well, winning seems to be a thing in the eyes or in the minds of the Trump administration to have ended or been detrimental or finalized with the assassination of Khamenei. But given the continuity of the Iranian regime and continuing this war with both the United States and Israel, it seems like they're trying to reframe a new symbolic achievement, reframe a new symbolic way that would allow them to not look like they left the war without minimizing the influence and the power structures of the Iranian regime. So we're trying to figure that out in the coming days. But so far, from an Iranian point of view, survival seems to be a very symbolic achievement, both domestically in the eyes of the public opinion in Iran, but also regionally, given that it has also been able to pull the Gulf region into being part of this existential threat. It might be a short-term achievement from a militarized mindset in the Iranian regime's mindset, but it's certainly a very detrimental long-term consequence for Iran's relationship in the neighborhood.
As you say, this is now a regional conflict with several fronts. We've seen in the last hour a new attack in Iraq, in the western Anbar province, on the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF. How difficult is that for the Iraqi government, a fragile Iraqi government? How difficult is it for them to navigate this crisis right now? They're walking a very tight rope, aren't they?
It's a very, very delicate act. The Iraqi government or the Iraqi political class, beyond the official ministerial cabinet, has been going through a very long process in trying to act between the influences and the interventions of both the United States and Iran. One cannot deny that Iran's influence in Iraq has been going through a major decrease since the 2019 protests in the country. The fate or the future of the Iran-aligned factions within the PMF, and not all of the PMF, has been a conversation that has been growing and becoming much more mature in the Iraqi political circles. One major political development that definitely paused that journey was the October 7 attacks in 2023. But now it's back into the picture. However, they're also trying to simultaneously understand how applicable is the containment or the elimination of the Iran-aligned factions within the PMF if the Iranian regime survives and comes out of a deal with the US.
So how do you see the outcome of the conflict between the US, Israel and Iran shaping what happens not just in Iraq but also in Lebanon?
There are two different scenarios, given that Hezbollah has a much more stronger association and a much more official way with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the recent attacks and the recent developments have made it very clear that the way Israel has also dragged Lebanon into this wider conflict that isn't necessarily directly connected to what's happening in the Gulf region, which is another evidence of Israel's insistence in continuing its military aggression and political interest in Lebanon, regardless of what happens on the fronts that involves Iran directly in the Gulf region, but also with the United States. From an Iraqi perspective or an Iraqi political perspective, a regime change in Iran will either make the Iran factions or the Iran-aligned factions within the PMF much more aggressive, given that they're now fighting an existential threat where they're trying to fight for their continuity and existence, regardless of what happens with the Iranian regime. But also there's another side, or there are a few other factions within the Iran-aligned factions, which would be much more interested in a much more pragmatic relationship position with both the Iraqi government, but also the future U.S. ally.
A very complex battlefield. Thank you so much for explaining it so clearly to us. Zeidon Alkinani, thank you for joining us on Al Jazeera. Director of the Arab Perspectives Institute. Good to have you back, Zeidon. As we see now, this conflict between the U.S., Israel and Iran is not just between those three countries, but a regional one in Iraq, in Lebanon. We're just having the Spanish Prime Minister now saying that the Israelis, Israel's Netanyahu, want to inflict on Lebanon the same destruction as in Gaza. How will the outcome of whatever is decided between the Americans and the Iranians, Israelis, affect the crises in the rest of the region, whether in Iraq or Lebanon?
Significantly, but the transitionary period that was already in planning in a future post-Hezbollah or in a future post the Iran-aligned factions within the PMF was already on the table. It might get much more intensified based on the results that might erupt from the war with Iran. The communities and the agencies that would have hoped for a much more limited political involvement of the Iran proxies in the region, whether that's Iraq or Lebanon or beyond, would imagine that a US-Iran deal coming out of this war would make these hopes and imaginations much more decreased, given that a survival of the Iranian regime after everything it went through for the past month would be seen as a symbolic achievement that it can use as a regional confidence to maintain its proxy influence. Much more or less for sure, but it will definitely make it stronger than before in the region.
But we're nowhere near a US-Iran deal yet, despite Donald Trump saying that negotiations are underway, the Iranians denying this, of course. Is there real diplomacy going on right now, or is it just an extension of battlefield strategy?
Well, the way the war looks like and the status quo of it, we're certainly not anywhere near a deal. But if we were to compare the conditions that Trump had presented from the first day, which is a complete surrender, to proposing points that were not completely eliminated from the Iranian political mindset, it seems like we are closer to a deal than ever. There's certainly an American realization of the consequences of what an economic warfare towards the Gulf region and how it translates to the global economy.
Yeah, the UN Human Rights Chief just this hour saying that there's $63 billion in economic losses as a result of this conflict, which is huge.
It's huge, and that's from the UN perspective, which is trying to look at it from an international perspective. We have countries such as the Philippines, which is going through a detrimental economic crisis with the fuel prices. Winter, if this war would lead, God forbid, in the next few months, a winter gas crisis might erupt in Europe, which might make it even detrimental for these European allies to push against the US, which would already be facing the pressures of the midterm elections to find an end to the war. Trump is trying to buy time to ensure that the war doesn't end without a symbolic achievement that he could sell it back to the American media.
So what do you see as militarily achievable right now in the short term, and what would be an acceptable end of state for either sides in this conflict?
The Iranian regime is openly and publicly making sure that it wants to ensure security guarantees. As much as it may not trust it in the long term, it wants a much more stronger international institutional involvement to ensure that it could prevent such a conflict from happening in the future. But realistically speaking, even if those security guarantees were to be put on the table, one cannot deny that Israel might work unilaterally in its regional conflict towards Iran in the future. If US were no longer to take the front seat in this war, Israel has been doing its own type of agendas in the region beyond the acceptance and the approvals, whether it were to follow the international law or international institutions. But given the economic crisis, given the global economy that is reflecting the challenges this is presenting to the rest of the world, it seems like the Strait of Hormuz is the triggering point here.
Right.
Whether the U.S. will be able to present economic solutions to the countries and the economies that have been impacted by the limited passage of the Strait of Hormuz, or will it continue to be a monopolized political leverage by the Iranian regime?
Zeidon, what about the Gulf states? Where does this all leave them? Once this conflict is over, it will end eventually. Where will their strategic positioning go?
Well, they'll have to revisit a lot of the calculations that were regarding their existential threat in the region. They're going through a very strong, delicate act between a permanent geographical neighbor, but also a long-standing partner for the past few decades, such as the United States. One cannot deny that there will be a lot of questioning to the level of trust if it were to be maintained with the United States. But we also cannot deny that the Trump administration is also a very unique administration that may not translate and reflect the overarching political institutional agenda in the region. But also one interesting element, a unique element that may have erupted from this war is a very strong political consciousness across the Gulf states in planning a future which is much more unified and collective despite their minor differences.
All right. Thank you so much for talking to us about this. Always good.